Right now, sanctions shape global markets, energy prices, and power. But what if they never existed? Fact 1. Without US sanctions on Russia, global energy markets would likely look dramatically different today. Russian oil and natural gas would have continued flowing freely into Western economies, especially across Europe and even indirectly into American supply chains. This could have kept fuel prices significantly lower in the short term, easing inflation pressures for millions of American households. However, it would also deepen long-term dependence on a geopolitical rival. The US energy sector, particularly domestic shale producers, might have faced stronger competition, slowing investment and job growth in key states like Texas and North Dakota. Fact 2. If sanctions had never been imposed, Russia's economy would likely be far more integrated into the global financial system. American banks, corporations, and investors would still be actively engaged in Russian markets, creating billions in mutual financial exposure. On one hand, this interdependence could reduce the likelihood of open conflict, as economic ties often act as a stabilizing force. On the other hand, it would give Russia significantly more leverage over Western economies. In times of crisis, that leverage could be used strategically, leaving the US vulnerable in ways that are harder to control. Fact 3. Without sanctions, American consumers might not feel the same urgency around energy independence or supply chain security. The push toward domestic production, alternative energy, and reshoring manufacturing has been partly driven by geopolitical risks. Without those pressures, the US could remain more reliant on global systems that prioritize efficiency over resilience. While this might lower costs in the short term, it increases long-term vulnerability. A future crisis, whether political or economic, could hit harder, because the systems in place were never designed to withstand disruption. Fact 4. The absence of sanctions would also reshape global alliances. European nations, especially those heavily dependent on Russian energy, might have maintained closer ties with Moscow, instead of aligning more tightly with US policy. This could weaken the unity of Western alliances like NATO, creating fractures in collective decision-making. For the United States, that means less influence on the global stage and more difficulty coordinating responses to international crises. At the same time, some argue this scenario could reduce tensions, but at the cost of a more fragmented and unpredictable world order. Fact 5. Without sanctions, Russia's military funding would likely have remained stronger and more stable over time. Energy revenues, especially from oil and gas exports, are a major source of state income. Without restrictions, those revenues could flow freely, potentially increasing long-term military investment. For Americans, this raises a difficult question. Would fewer sanctions reduce tensions, or quietly enable a stronger adversary? While some argue engagement prevents escalation, others would see this as allowing risks to grow unchecked, creating a future conflict that could be far more costly and harder to contain. Fact 6. American businesses would likely have had far greater access to Russian markets, especially in sectors like technology, finance, and manufacturing. Large US corporations could expand operations, create joint ventures, and tap into a resource-rich economy. This could generate profits, jobs, and shareholder value back home, but it also creates moral and strategic trade-offs. Companies would face pressure from American consumers and lawmakers questioning those partnerships. Over time, business decisions could become entangled with geopolitical tensions, forcing corporations into difficult positions where profit and national interest don't always align. Fact 7. Without sanctions, the global technology landscape might look more interconnected, but also more complicated. Russia would likely remain more integrated into Western digital infrastructure, including software ecosystems, cybersecurity networks, and financial technologies. This could foster innovation and collaboration in some areas. However, it also increases exposure to cyber risks. For the United States, deeper integration means a larger attack surface and more difficult boundaries between cooperation and conflict. The absence of sanctions doesn't eliminate threats. It can blur the lines, making it harder to distinguish between partnership and vulnerability. Fact 8. Perhaps most importantly, without sanctions, the signal sent by the United States to the world would be fundamentally different. Sanctions are not just economic tools, they are statements of values and consequences. Without them, other nations might interpret silence or inaction as acceptance. This could reshape global expectations about accountability, influencing how future conflicts are handled. For Americans, this becomes a deeper question than policy. It becomes about identity. Does avoiding economic pressure preserve stability, or does it slowly erode the standards the country claims to defend? Fact 9. Without sanctions, Europe's energy dependence on Russia would likely have deepened even further, delaying diversification efforts. Projects like LNG terminals, renewable investments, and alternative pipelines may not have accelerated as quickly. For the United States, this creates a mixed outcome. On one hand, global energy markets would be more stable and predictable. On the other, America would lose strategic leverage as a major energy exporter. In a crisis, allies might hesitate to take unified action, knowing their economies are tightly tied to Russian supply. Fact 10. The US dollar's global dominance might face subtle but important shifts. Sanctions have pushed some countries to explore alternatives to the dollar-based financial system. Without them, that pressure would be weaker, potentially reinforcing the dollar's central role in global trade. However, continued integration with Russia could also expose US financial systems to new risks, including corruption, capital flight, and opaque transactions. The trade-off becomes clear: stronger dominance in the short term, but with underlying vulnerabilities that could surface unexpectedly. Fact 11. Without sanctions, public opinion inside the United States might be far more divided and less informed about global conflicts involving Russia. Sanctions often act as a visible signal that something significant has occurred. Without that signal, many Americans might not feel the urgency or awareness of international events. This could reduce political pressure on leaders, but also weaken democratic engagement on foreign policy decisions. The absence of action doesn't mean the absence of consequences. It can simply make those consequences less visible until they become unavoidable. Fact 12. American defense spending priorities could shift in a world without sanctions. If economic pressure tools were not used, policymakers might rely more heavily on military deterrence to respond to geopolitical tensions. This could lead to increased defense budgets over time, affecting federal spending and domestic priorities. For taxpayers, this becomes a direct trade-off. Fewer economic interventions abroad might result in higher military costs at home. The question becomes not whether costs exist, but where they are felt and how visible they are to the public. Fact 13. Without sanctions, Russia's relationships with countries like China, India, and others might evolve more slowly. Sanctions have accelerated alternative alliances and trade networks outside Western systems. Without that pressure, Russia might remain more economically tied to Western markets, instead of strengthening these parallel systems. For the United States, this could preserve influence in the short term, but it might also delay the recognition of a shifting global balance, creating a false sense of stability while deeper structural changes continue beneath the surface. Fact 14. Without sanctions, global food markets might have experienced fewer disruptions, particularly in grain and fertilizer supplies. Russia is a major exporter of both, and uninterrupted trade could stabilize prices worldwide, including in the United States. Lower input costs for American farmers might translate into more predictable food prices for consumers. However, this stability comes with a trade-off. Continued reliance on Russian exports could leave global agriculture exposed to future political leverage, where supply becomes a strategic tool rather than just an economic one. Fact 15. The American defense industry might face a different kind of pressure without sanctions. Reduced geopolitical tension, at least on the surface, could slow demand for certain military technologies and contracts. This might lead to fewer jobs or slower growth in defense-related sectors. At the same time, a less confrontational environment could allow resources to shift toward domestic priorities like infrastructure or healthcare. The challenge is that reduced tension can be temporary, and scaling military readiness back up later is far more difficult than maintaining it consistently. Fact 16. Without sanctions, cultural and academic exchanges between the United States and Russia would likely remain more active. Universities, research institutions, and cultural organizations could collaborate more freely, potentially leading to scientific breakthroughs and stronger people-to-people connections. This could humanize both sides and reduce long-term hostility. However, it also raises concerns about intellectual property, security risks, and the transfer of sensitive technologies. The line between collaboration and vulnerability becomes increasingly thin, especially in fields like artificial intelligence, energy, and advanced engineering. Fact 17. The global perception of American leadership would likely shift in a world without sanctions. Allies might question whether the United States is willing to use its economic power to respond to international conflicts. This could weaken trust in US commitments and encourage other nations to act independently. On the other hand, some countries might view the absence of sanctions as a more diplomatic, less confrontational approach. The result is a divided perception. Either America is avoiding escalation, or it is stepping back from its role as a global enforcer. Fact 18. Without sanctions, internal political dynamics within Russia could evolve differently over time. Economic pressure often influences domestic conditions, including public opinion and policy decisions. Without that pressure, the Russian government might experience greater economic stability, potentially reducing internal dissent tied to economic hardship. For the United States, this creates a complex outcome. Stability in another major power can reduce immediate global risk, but it may also limit external influence on political change, leaving fewer tools to shape outcomes beyond diplomacy or force. Fact 19. Without sanctions, global oil prices might have remained lower and more stable over the past years, directly affecting everyday life in the United States. Lower gasoline prices would ease pressure on American families, reduce transportation costs, and slow inflation across multiple sectors. For many households, this would feel like immediate relief. However, cheaper global energy also discourages domestic production and investment in renewables. Over time, this could weaken America's long-term energy independence, leaving the country more exposed to external supply shocks when stability inevitably breaks. Fact 20. Without sanctions, American pension funds and institutional investors would likely have deeper exposure to Russian assets. This could increase returns during stable periods, benefiting retirees and long-term investors, but it also introduces serious risks. Political instability or sudden conflict could wipe out those investments overnight. For Americans, this becomes personal, not abstract geopolitics, but retirement savings and financial security. The absence of sanctions doesn't remove risk, it redistributes it, often placing it directly into the portfolios of ordinary citizens who may not even realize the exposure. Fact 21. The global arms market could evolve differently without sanctions. Russia is one of the world's largest arms exporters, and unrestricted access to financial systems would likely expand its reach. This could intensify competition with US defense exports, potentially reducing American influence in key regions. At the same time, increased availability of advanced weapons worldwide could raise global instability. For Americans, this creates a difficult balance: economic competition abroad versus a more heavily armed and unpredictable international environment that could eventually draw the US into new conflicts. Fact 22. Without sanctions, the development of alternative financial systems designed to bypass Western control might slow significantly. Countries like China and others have been motivated to build parallel systems partly due to fear of sanctions. Without that pressure, the US-led financial order could remain dominant for longer. This strengthens American influence in global trade. However, it may also create complacency. By delaying the emergence of alternatives, the US risks being less prepared for a future where its financial dominance is eventually challenged more abruptly and with less warning. Fact 23. Without sanctions, diplomatic channels between the United States and Russia might remain more open and consistent. Economic ties often create incentives for ongoing dialogue, even during periods of tension. This could reduce the risk of sudden escalation and provide more opportunities for negotiation. However, stronger economic relationships can also complicate decision-making. Leaders may hesitate to act decisively if major financial interests are at stake. For Americans, this raises a key question. Does deeper engagement prevent conflict, or does it delay necessary action until the stakes are even higher? Fact 24. Without sanctions, the perception of fairness in global rules could shift dramatically. Many countries watch how the United States applies economic pressure and draw conclusions about consistency and accountability. Without sanctions in this case, some nations might feel that international rules are applied selectively, or not at all. This could weaken trust in global institutions and agreements. For Americans, this isn't just about foreign policy. it's about credibility. If rules are not enforced consistently, the entire system becomes harder to defend, both abroad and at home. Fact 25. Without sanctions, US allies in Eastern Europe would likely feel significantly more exposed and uncertain about their security. Countries bordering Russia have relied on strong Western responses as a signal of protection and commitment. Without that signal, their trust in American leadership could weaken. This might push them to increase their own military spending or pursue independent security strategies. For the United States, that means less coordinated alliances and more fragmented defense planning. Stability may appear intact on the surface, but underlying fear and distrust could quietly reshape the balance of power. Fact 26. Without sanctions, global corporations might normalize operating in politically sensitive environments, including Russia, without major restrictions. This could create a precedent where economic opportunity outweighs political or ethical concerns. American companies would face fewer barriers, but also greater scrutiny from the public. Consumers in the US might begin questioning where products come from and what values companies actually support. Over time, this tension could reshape corporate responsibility, forcing businesses to navigate a more complex landscape, where profit, reputation, and national identity are constantly in conflict. Fact 27. Without sanctions, Russia's role in global energy infrastructure projects could expand further, including pipelines, nuclear technology, and long-term supply agreements. This could increase efficiency and reduce global energy costs in the short term. However, it also concentrates influence in critical infrastructure. For the United States, this creates a strategic dilemma. Cheaper global energy benefits consumers, but control over infrastructure can be used as leverage during geopolitical disputes. The question becomes whether economic efficiency today is worth potential strategic vulnerability tomorrow. Fact 28. Without sanctions, the pace of innovation in alternative energy might slow, particularly in Western countries. High energy prices and geopolitical risks have been major drivers of investment in renewables and energy independence. Without those pressures, governments and private companies might delay large-scale transitions. For Americans, this could mean lower costs now but slower progress toward long-term sustainability. The absence of urgency often leads to delayed action, and by the time the need becomes unavoidable, the cost of catching up could be significantly higher. Fact 29. Without sanctions, intelligence and cybersecurity dynamics could become more complex rather than less tense. Increased economic and technological integration between Russia and the West would create more shared systems, networks, and data flows. While this could improve communication, it also expands opportunities for espionage and cyber operations. For the United States, this means a more interconnected but potentially more vulnerable digital environment. The challenge is that deeper integration doesn't eliminate conflict. It changes how and where that conflict takes place, often making it harder to detect and respond. Fact 30. Without sanctions, the long-term narrative of global leadership could shift in ways that are difficult to reverse. The United States has historically used economic tools to enforce international norms. Without applying those tools in a major case, future responses might carry less weight. Other nations could test boundaries more openly, assuming consequences will be limited. For Americans, this raises a fundamental question about the future. Is restraint a sign of strength, or does it invite challenges that become harder to manage over time? Fact 31. Without sanctions, the long-term relationship between the American public and foreign policy decisions could become more distant and less engaged. Sanctions often serve as a visible response that signals action without direct military involvement. Without them, many Americans might feel that the government is either inactive or overly cautious in global crises. This could reduce trust in leadership or, conversely, reduce anxiety about foreign conflicts. The emotional connection between everyday Americans and international events would likely weaken, making future decisions feel more sudden and less understood. Fact 32. Without sanctions, Russia's integration into global trade organizations and agreements might remain stronger and more stable. This could lead to fewer disruptions in international commerce and more predictable economic relationships. For the United States, this stability benefits multinational corporations and global supply chains. However, it also reduces leverage. When disputes arise, economic pressure becomes harder to apply effectively. The absence of sanctions today could limit options tomorrow, forcing the US to rely more heavily on diplomacy or military presence when economic tools are no longer sufficient. Fact 33. Without sanctions, internal debates within the United States about foreign policy priorities would likely intensify. Some Americans would argue that economic engagement promotes peace and stability, while others would see it as enabling long-term threats. This divide could become more visible in elections, media, and public discourse. The issue would no longer be about whether sanctions are effective, but whether avoiding them is responsible. Over time, this could reshape how Americans define strength, leadership, and accountability on the global stage. Fact 34. Without sanctions, crisis response timelines could become slower and more complicated. Economic measures are often one of the fastest tools governments can deploy. Without them, policymakers would need to rely more heavily on negotiations, alliances, or military positioning. This could delay responses in critical moments, allowing situations to escalate further before action is taken. For Americans, this means potential risks grow quietly before becoming visible. The absence of early pressure does not prevent conflict. It can allow it to develop with fewer immediate constraints. Fact 35. Without sanctions, the long-term balance between economic benefit and national security would become increasingly difficult to manage. Short-term gains, lower prices, stronger trade, and stable markets would be clear and immediate, but the long-term risks would be harder to measure and easier to ignore. For the United States, this creates a quiet but powerful tension. How much risk is acceptable for the sake of stability? And at what point does stability become dependence that cannot be easily reversed? No sanctions, fewer limits. Would that bring peace, or just delay consequences? What would you choose?